Hey kids, let's talk about the good old days growing up in Idaho. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Growing Up in Idaho, talking about the good old days. So how's everyone doing? How is the rioting going in your particular community? Is anyone burning up the streets, tearing down buildings, painting stuff, destroying things? It's kind of sad to see that happening. I believe in citizens' right to go out and address their government and try to get attention to their cause, whatever it might be. Hopefully worthy causes. But I don't believe in destroying public property and doing things that leave a mess for someone else to come along and clean up. And I hope that at some point in our future, hopefully soon, we'll be able to collectively get past this particular dark point in our nation's history. So I saw a meme the other day that kind of goes along with this. It was a picture of, the rioters out in the streets destroying public property. And you could see fires in the background and, these masked individuals in their mean looks, just ripping and destroying stuff. And the words on the meme, I can't remember the exact words, but it went something like, people my age don't do this kind of thing because in our day, we got spanked. We got our butts beat. And we were disciplined, so we don't do this kind of stuff. And I got a kick out of that because it instantly brought my mind back to, the good old days growing up in Idaho. And certainly in my house, Mike and Bertie Hicks's home, the laboratory that I grew up in, spankings were a common thing. They happened often. And, for all of you who understand that principle, you realize that there was a time when you were a kid that you were kind of scared of your parents because they wielded the paddle. Now, I wasn't in fear of my life, and really I wasn't in fear of my dad or mom. But I knew that when they gave me that look, and you know what that is, you know what that means. When I got that look, I knew it was time to settle down and stop whatever it was that I was doing. Behave myself, is how my dad used to put it. Jeff, just behave yourself and you'll be all right. It could have meant a lot of things, just depended on the moment. But whatever it was that I was doing that was bothering people or irritating people, pissing people off, I needed to stop doing that. And I knew if I didn't, there'd be consequences. Usually a butt kicking, as my dad would call it, or a paddling. And, it's called corporal punishment. And actually, in most states in the Union, corporal punishment still is allowed. Parents can spank their kids without going to jail, despite what, people might say. And certainly, back in the 60s and 70s when I grew up, spanking was a thing. Everybody got spanked. Even in school, kids were getting spanked. I remember Mrs. Thomas in the first grade. She spanked everybody. Thankfully, I never got it. She had this little paddle. I think it was like a ping pong paddle. And she would wail on kids' hind ends if they got out of line. Yeah, you wouldn't see that happening now, but it was a thing back in 1970. For all of you who knew my dad, Mike Hicks, he taught 7th and 8th grade, junior high number of subjects, social studies mainly. But he had a paddle. He paddled kids often when they got out of line. Kids knew if you screwed up in junior high school in the Brooklyn Junior High, you were probably going to have to go see Mr. Hicks and get your butt beat. Well, it's not beating, but it's spanking. Kind of the same thing, just a little softer image, But anyway, you all understand how those days were if you lived through them, and you understand that that was part of the discipline of those days. And, but I thought about that meme, and I thought, fact is, I remember things getting out of control in society a little bit back in the 60s and 70s. My dad was a cop in the 60s, so I heard all his stories about hippies and drug addicts and people who were causing trouble in the community in Boise, where I lived for the first 5 years of my life. And Dad was a great storyteller. And he could make a story come alive. You know those people who take an ordinary incident and make a really great story out of it. But Dad had that ability. It was a talent. And it's an art form, I guess, if you think about it. But, of course, I heard all of his stories. Some of those stories scared me. I thought, my dad's out there with the bad guys. What happens if his weapons, if his gun or his nightstick or the sap he carried or whatever it was didn't work? What if the hippies ganged up on him? It was kind of a scary thought that I had in the back of my mind as a little kid. It wasn't very pleasant. But anyway, years later, Dad always kept his .357 Magnum right there in the drawer by his bed because he was ready to use it if needed. And, that's how it was in Idaho, at least, with most families that I'm aware of. Everybody had guns in their houses, in their cars. Some of them even carried them around. Not many, but some. And it was just something we all grew up with. But the fact is, we did have our problems back in the 60s and 70s when I was a kid. It was just a different era, and people's mindsets were different. I think that there was more respect for authority in those days. And you could tell, when a cop pulled up, usually, hopefully, it was yes or no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And then you would go on your way. Of course, we can't really say that this generation is worse than the one before or the one before that. But things are definitely different now. And I think that those who have the ability to compare will understand what I'm saying. The Vietnam War, I remember when some of those guys came home in around 1972, 74, in those times. In Salmon, I don't think anybody can forget Bob Durand. He was a colorful individual who came home after fighting in Vietnam. And he kind of made his mark on the community. I remember Dad, at the time, was the high school principal. Later on, and Bob came around looking for work as a security guard for the school. Bob and another guy had a security business. Just like a night security, they'd come and check your place and make sure everything was okay when it was closed at night. And as I recall the story from my dad, he hired Bob to keep an eye on the school at night, just go and check things out and make sure there's nobody painting swastikas on the side of the school or some stupid thing. So Dad pulled up one night. He had to go in late to get something out of his office. He pulled up, noticed someone was on the roof of the school. So he walked up a little closer, recognized the figure. It looked like Bob up there walking around. Then he got a little closer and realized Bob, or whoever it was, had a rifle in their hands. So he yelled up, "Hey, Bob, is that you?" "What do you need, Mike?" "Well, Bob, why don't you come down and we'll have a little talk." So it took a few minutes. Bob found his way back down off the roof. Dad said, "Hey, this is really not what I had in mind. checking on the school. I don't want you on the roof patrolling with your rifle, Bob. Just come out here and maybe make one quick walk around the school to make sure everything's okay, and that's all I really want you to do. You don't need to bring your rifle, even. So they got a better understanding, and Bob continued on. But, Bob was an interesting guy. He came home with a lot of interesting skills from his time in Vietnam. As you recall, he knew martial arts. I'm not sure exactly what particular type of martial arts, but I know that he would run barefooted all over the place, out the highway, back home, all over town. And occasionally, he would take out that big samurai sword he carried and would hack on stuff. And then he'd put it away and run back into town. I remember getting off work one time. This would have been when I was about 16. I was driving that Chevelle Super Sport at that time. I had to run into town to get some gas. You remember those days. Your car drank gas, lots of gas. I think I got between 12 and 14 miles per gallon in that Chevelle. And that was on a good day when I wasn't going 100 miles an hour everywhere. But anyway, Bob was running into town barefooted in his karate stuff. And he flagged me down. Of course I stopped. I wouldn't even think of not stopping. Pulled over. He came up to the car and got in, opened the door. He said, "Hey, I'm tired out. You mind taking me into town?" I'm like, "Yeah, Bob, hop in. Of course. I'll take you to town." He jumped in, closed the door, and Bob's kind of a quiet guy, never said much, at least to me. He asked me if I was Mike Hicks's kid. I'm like, yeah, Mike's my dad. And so we got into town right there by the Husky station, and I pulled over, and he said, he opened the door and got out. He looked in before he closed the door, and he gave me this stern look. And he said, "Jeff, if anybody, and I mean anybody, gives you any trouble, you just tell me and I'll take care of him." I'm like, "Okay, Bob, thanks." He closed the door and left. But anyway, Bob was an interesting guy, and he was a product of that Vietnam era, and in a colorful character in the town of Salmon. We all remember him. But we remember that hippie culture. We always got a full crew of hippies driving through town every summer a lot of times on their choppers. You probably remember those guys parking their bikes out in front of the Owl Club or the Lantern, and they're on Main Street, and there'd be a lot of times fist fights every fall during fair time, and when the cowboys were in town for the rodeo. Seemed like there'd be fistfights between the hippies and the cowboys. In fact, I remember one time coming out of the rodeo with my dad, and there was a big fight going on. This cowboy picked this hippie up by the hair and swung him around and smashed his body against a building. I was just a kid, probably 10 years old. And Dad grabbed me by the arm and hustled me over to the car. So we talked about it on the way home. He said, "Jeff, that's how grown men fight. And you fight to win. And when you get older, you'll understand that concept. There's no messing around. If you know there's going to be a fight, you rip into somebody and you take care of them quickly. And that's just how men do it. So keep that in your mind." And I remember that, and I remember the scene. And, I saw a lot of fights growing up, but that was probably the craziest one I ever saw. But anyway, the point I want to make in this podcast, and we'll move along and kind of get to it, is the changing of the generations and how discipline worked back when we all remember. back in the old days, the good old days. One of the things that I remember growing up was, like I mentioned, there was discipline in the Mike and Bertie Hicks house. And one of the things that was expected of every kid that grew up in that house was that we would be polite and kind to our mother. That means we wouldn't smart off at her and hurt her feelings. And if we did, there was going to be hell to pay after that, and we knew that. In fact, I remember one time I was walking down with the milk bucket, heading down to milk the cows. It was my turn. It seemed like it was always my turn. But on this night, I was kind of happy it was, because it's about halfway to the barn, I heard a commotion in the house behind me. Sounded like a war zone with grenades and rocket launchers and people yelling. And I thought, what the hell is going on up there? Man, I'm glad I'm not in there. Something serious happened. I suppose I'll find out about it later. So I went on down and milked the cow. The cows, back in those days, we had 3 cows we milked by hand. I milked all those stupid cows, carried the milk back up, strained it, and got it put away, and then headed upstairs. Thought, this is going to be interesting. I wonder what happened earlier. Well, come to find out, my brother smarted off at Mom. Now, you have to understand, if you don't know my brother Mike, he's 18 months older than me, and he's the oldest kid, and I'm number 2. And he always gave me a good example of what not to do. I could just step back, take some quick mental notes of things that went south for him and realize, hey, if I do that, I'm going to get the same punishment. I won't do that. At least I won't get caught doing it. That was kind of the secret, right? If you knew what you were doing as a kid, you just don't get caught doing stuff and you'll be all right. Usually. Anyway, Mike smarted off at Mom, hurt her feelings, and Dad came unglued. And Mike got his punishment. Ended up down in his room, kind of blubbering and bawling. Now, Mike at this time was a young kid, but he was big. He weighed 175 pounds when he was 10 years old. And he, by all rights and purposes, he was almost like a grown man. And during this incident, I think he was 13 or 14. This is probably the last time Dad ever had to get after him seriously. But anyway, Mike ended up down in his room, kind of sniffling and upset after getting his punishment. Dad went down 20 minutes later and said, okay, let's have a little talk. You know why you got punished? Yeah, I guess. Well, listen, here's how it works. What would you do if somebody came up to your girlfriend and smarted off at them the same way you smarted off at your mother? I'd beat the hell out of them. Well, that's just what happened to you. Your mother is my sweetheart, kind of like my girlfriend, if you want to put it that way. And nobody, I mean nobody, is ever going to smart off at her and hurt her feelings. Not around me, anyway. And if I ever hear of it, I'll go after him. And that includes all of you kids, especially you older boys, because you should know better. You understand? Yep, I do, Dad. And that was the end of it. But that's how things worked back in those days. But here's an interesting thing. Some of you might remember, back in the late 70s, some of the psychologists got together, some of the psychologists in the country got together. Some books were published about how women and men should be raising their kids. And, I don't know what they were. I was a kid at the time, and I didn't care about that stuff necessarily, but I heard about it because my mom tried out some of these new strategies to make their kids behave. And I remember having some of this stuff used on me. And the reason I remember it so well is suddenly the beating stopped and a new strategy was put into play. It was called timeout. I was about 11, maybe 12 years old when I got this tried on me. Now you have to understand, and let me give you the background. My room was clear full of books. I had every Louis L'Amour book and every Edgar Rice Burroughs book, all the Tarzan series that was ever printed, and all in paperback, and they were all slung in my bookshelves all over my room. And the way I got involved in at least Louis L'Amour was Dad and I, when I was about 8 years old, had the mumps at the same time. So Mom put us in the same room, in this queen-sized bed, and that's where we stayed for over a week. Dad had to stay home from school, so did I. And after the first day, Dad looked over at me and he said, "Hey, we're going to be here a while, Jeff, and this is going to be miserable. It's going to be worse than hell, laying in this bed for over a week, trying to recover from this illness if we don't have something to do." And he thought for a minute. And suddenly he's like, "I got an idea." He got up, left for about 5 minutes, and came back with his arms clear full of books. And he slung them on the bed, picked one up, and I looked over and recognized it was a cowboy novel. And Dad told me, "Jeff, this guy, this Louis L'Amour, is the best Western writer there is. Have you ever read any of his books?" Well, of course I hadn't. I was a little 8-year-old kid. The only thing I was reading was those crazy books in the library at school. He started reading the first book. I think it was a Sackett novel. And if you've ever read any of Louis L'Amour, you'll understand the Sackett series. Talks about the Western family that, started out back in the ancient times and progressed clear up through the Western times, moving west and helping settle the Western United States. And after the first book, I was hooked. I loved those. And I'm like, "Dad, you don't have to read anymore. I'll just read myself." And so I grabbed another one and started reading. So we spent over a week together laying there recovering from that horrible illness. And if any of you remember the mumps, you'll know it was horrible. You get those swollen glands and you ache and feel like somebody's beating the crap out of you. So we laid there and read Louis L'Amour. And after that, I was hooked. And I wanted all of them. So I started collecting them. Every penny I got, I'd go down and buy a new one. And Dad helped me out. He gave me a few of his if he had more than one of the same title. And then a little later, I got hooked on the Edgar Rice Burroughs books, especially the Tarzan books. So I had every one of those also. So anyway, that's the foundation to lay the background for this story. When Mom tried out her new timeout strategy, I got into trouble. I was probably 12, maybe even 13, a teenager. And I screwed up, did something stupid. So she, did the usual, yelled me out, "Get down to your room, Buster." And I thought, that's interesting. No threats of getting my butt kicked. So I sauntered down to my room. She's like, "You stay down there and think about what you did. You're in timeout." I thought, that's interesting. I've never heard of this. But I guess it must be a new discipline. I'm kind of happy about it. As I was walking down there, I was thinking, this is something I might like. I went in my room, closed the door, grabbed a Edgar Rice Burroughs book, laid on my bed and started reading. Well, I got through that one. You can read those books in about 2.5 hours. I got through that one, grabbed a Louis L'Amour, The Man from Skibbereen, and was almost finished with that. And going on to the next one, when Mom showed up. She whipped the door open. "What are you doing in here?" I said, "Well, I was put into timeout, I think is what you called it. And so I'm just doing timeout." "Don't be smart with me. You've been down here for 5 hours. I said, "Well, if we're counting hours, I think we're probably a little closer to 6, but yeah, I've been down here a while, Mom." "Well, smarty pants, get outside. You're not doing timeout anymore." So that was the first and last timeout session I ever had. But I kind of enjoyed it. It was a good discipline. I loved reading, catching up on my favorite literature. And sure enough, true to her word, I never got time out anymore. But by that time I was old enough I didn't do discipline. In fact, that time I was driving regularly and had a job. And probably would have just chuckled if I'd have got put into time out. Would have been more rest and relaxation. It's like, don't throw me in that briar patch. But anyway, timeout didn't work in our house. It just didn't catch on. And I think all the kids would have liked it if it would have. So, everybody went back to the spankings. We won't call them beatings because that's kind of harsh, but, spankings, hard spankings was what was going on. And, when I raised my kids, I preferred not spanking, but each kid was different. My youngest son actually preferred spankings. If he had the choice, he'd say, "Spank me, Dad, spank me, please. Don't put me in timeout." He couldn't stand timeout. He couldn't stand to be alone in his room. It drove him crazy. And so that was what he got as punishment. "Ben, if you act up again, you're going into timeout." "Oh, Dad, don't do that to me. I'll straighten up." And he did. He was a good kid. And so anyway, sometimes you have to get a kid's attention. And so back to the original statement. Would kids who got spanked be out there looting and destroying stuff in the streets? Well, I don't know. It's a good question. Because I remember kids from my generation and the generation before were out doing stupid, crazy things. But like I said earlier, I think the mindset is different. We weren't necessarily into destroying stuff. We were just doing stupid stuff, crazy things. We'd get wild ideas in our mind and go do them, and then realize how stupid it was and make apologies. And if our parents found out, which a lot of times they didn't, but if they did, then, we would take whatever punishment was coming to us and try to straighten up. And that's just how it was, at least in the community I grew up in. There were some bad apples. I remember a few of them. Some of my, the people I knew went to jail for whatever reason. Some kids just couldn't seem to catch on. They got involved in law breaking and did their time. But would we collectively go out and destroy stuff to make a point? I don't think so. At least not the kids I ran around with and the kids that I associated with in school. I just don't think it was part of our culture. We wouldn't have done that. We might have protested. In fact, I remember a sit-down protest that we had in junior high school one time. We were making a point. I can't even remember what it was about. Maybe someone listening to this podcast will remember. It was about 19 75, maybe 76, maybe even later, I don't know. But we all decided to sit down in the halls of the school and not go to class. We were protesting something important. And my dad and a few other teachers came out and told us, get our asses back to class right now, or you're all going to be in detention. Well, everybody, one by one, got up and went to class, and the protest was over. I think what it comes down to is kids need to learn respect, and discipline helps foster respect in kids. Thanks for listening. Growing up in Idaho, the good old days.